Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. And for those of you still making your way in, do join us as quickly as you can. Find yourself a seat. Here we are for session 3 of this year's forum. Well done for getting back on time. I hope you had plenty to eat and drink. And I just wonder, actually, I was just thinking as I was walking over to start the session, I wonder how many of you looked very closely at your food box, if you took one of the food boxes, and thought really hard about what was in it, where it came from, and what the real cost of each of those items in your food box was, and whether it had been produced to all of the high standards that so many of our speakers have aspired to in the morning sessions. You know, I wonder how much of the food was sustainably produced with a real commitment to sustainability, biodiversity, and affordable pricing, all wrapped up in one wonderful food box. It's not easy. And the reason I start that way is because we're now going to talk at some length about food price mechanisms. What represents the true cost of our food? How does the food system ensure that the cost is properly and equitably shared out amongst consumers and all of us as taxpayers, and it represents fair value for the farmers, the producers, and the middlemen, the food processors, the retailers, and everything in between. It's an extraordinarily complex chain, and the question of value is at the heart of it, particularly when we then talk about how to make it more sustainable. So what's going to happen over the next hour or so is that we're going to have 2 keynote presentations. Both of them will be on the big screens that we have here. We've got 2 wonderful participants. When we've heard from them, I'll quiz them for a little bit, give them a bit of a Q&A, and then I'm going to invite up to the stage 3 great panelists who are going to sort of pick over what we've heard, and I'm going to challenge them, but more particularly, you can challenge them too, because we're going to make that as interactive as we can, both here in our audience and online as well. And you've seen how that works, so I hope everybody will put their questions forward. So, without further ado, let me introduce our 2 keynote speakers. We have Maximo Torero-Cullen, who is the chief economist at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Maximo, give us a wave to make sure that we know you can hear us. There he is. Not just waving, but smiling too, which is good. Let's hope he's still smiling at the end of all of this. Maximo, welcome. And Pavan Sukhdev, welcome to you too. Pavan is the founder and CEO of GIST Impact. I believe you're in Mumbai, isn't that right, Pavan?
That is correct.
Yeah,
That's
great.
right.
So GIST, as I understand it, is a consultancy which uses science and data to help the private sector measure its impact in human, social, natural, nature-based, and financial terms. So it's a consultancy at the cutting edge of the discussion that we are having. So what I'm going to do to the 2 of you in your online locations, I'm going to say, Maximo, you give us your thoughts first, and then Pavan, and then when both of you are done, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we're going to hear from our panel here in Brussels. So thanks both for joining us, and Maximo, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Okay, thank you so much. So unsustainable agri-food systems practices deplete soil, pollute air and water, and reduce biodiversity and contribute to climate change. These environmental impacts, combined with large health bills as a result of unhealthy diets and the impacts related to social inequalities throughout the food system, are not reflected in the price paid for artificial, inexpensive food that we have become used to. It is increasingly argued that the transformation to more sustainable agri-food systems will require changes in food price mechanisms that reflect these costs. But that is the real price. But what is the real price of food, and what do we need to consider when we enact changes in price mechanisms? The real price is a price that corrects for the market failures and accounts for externalities. It is a fair price that reflects all assets used in the food production. It is a social price that exposes the harmful effects of child labor and that prevents the heritage being lost. And it is a price that can help a consumer to choose more healthy options. There is no unified standard today or method and accounting for the real price of food. The true cost accounting framework is gaining prominence as it encompasses measuring and valuing externalities across environmental, social, and economic and health domains. And we did a huge effort in FAO to develop a model to measure this type of trade-offs during the summit. But again, it's one element or one component of the externalities that we need to incorporate in the true cost accounting. Measuring and value across the 4 dimensions require a lot of information and many assumptions. To calculate the cost of food across the environmental domain means estimating the underlying costs related to the greenhouse gas emissions, soil loss, water use, biodiversity loss, soil, water, and air pollution. Just think on water. Very few countries have a real market of pricing water. And everything we move, any commodity that we export, has water behind it. And that normally is not properly valued when we move this commodity. Within the social domain, costs related to wage inequality, to inequalities in consumer access, to nutritious food, and to occupational hazards need to be calculated. The other economic costs often unaccounted in the price of food are the direct and market-related support measures that producers and consumers receive and costs related to food waste. And the health dimension, which includes direct medical costs and loss of labor productivity. There is a multitude of studies that have estimated the real cost of food, but these tend not to be comparable. For instance, the Rockefeller Foundation estimates that in the US, the food bill equals to $1.1 trillion a year, but the hidden costs in the US are another $1.1 trillion per year. Whereas Springman calculates the global health costs to be $1.2 trillion in 2030. This clearly shows that we are far from under the true figure today. But it is clear that tackling the issue of the destructive underpricing of food is important, and that the true cost analysis can play a role in promoting changes across agri-food systems by governments, investors, and producers and consumers. It can help governments to rethink agricultural policy support mechanisms and to create fair and appropriate rules and regulations, and in providing greater transparency so consumers are more aware of their choices. It can help investors to analyze and monitor the effects of their investments on the 4 domains. Using FAO exact tool, investors can calculate the effects of their investments on greenhouse gas emissions. Using the BINTAC tool, they can assess the effect of their investments on biodiversity. It can provide consumers with transparency and information about the food choices and provide an understanding as to why they should be willing to pay, at least in part, through the higher food prices. Prices are largely determined by the interaction of supply and demand, but food price mechanisms can be used to influence this dynamic. These mechanisms are generally defined at the national level, but they are often governed by intra-regional, like for example the UCAP, or global, like for example the WTO AOA framework, which together determine the policy space within which governments can enact price policy. This reminds us that while national priorities for food systems transformation remain paramount, agri-food systems cut across national borders. National decisions impact global markets, and global market evolutions impact national decisions both in the short and in the long term. The current global market context brings in sharp focus the potential difficulties of implementing transformation pathways towards more sustainable agri-food systems that are based on the implicit assumption that price mechanisms that fully internalize the externalities associated with food production will be needed to drive transformation. Today, both prices and input prices, notably energy and fertilizers, are at historical high levels. What we can learn from the current situation and what we can tell us about viable food prices in pursuit of transformation food systems is of essential essence. Adopting a true cost approach will help us to better understand the context, to better understand how we can use our inputs more efficiently, and better understand how we can minimize externalities. This effort is central for agriculture because it will allow us to align incentives and to have a better understanding of the consequences of our actions and the consequences of the policies being put in place, and at the same time, how to better manage our natural resources. And of course, consumer behavior will be central on this. This raises some serious questions when discussing how food systems can pay for the true cost. First, how should countries prioritize nutrition versus environmental versus social outcomes? Can price mechanisms be designed to ease pressure on consumers and producers during times of crisis? How will this prioritization change in relation to global food and input prices? And will this mean lowering ambition of strategies such as the EU Green Deal and or the Farm to Fork or the Farm Bill in the case of the US? Again, it's extremely important for us to understand this concept, to understand that understanding what is the real cost behind each of the inputs being used, the effects they have on the nature, and the effects they will have on the environment through greenhouse gas emissions, and the effect that the policies will have, and how they will influence the incentives that we need to have in place to be able to create the agri-food system transformation. And just to finalize, when we refer to agri-food system transformation, and not just to food systems, it's because the agricultural system and the food system is not only combined of food production, it's also combined of fibers, for example, biofuels, and other elements that are part of this agri-food system. And both of them are sources of income and food that allow also to help us access to these resources. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any question later.
Great. Well, Maximo, I have got, actually, as it happens, lots of questions, because I found that fascinating, but I'm not going to ask them right now. I'm going to invite Pavan to take the virtual floor from Mumbai. We'll listen to you, Pavan, and then I'll have some questions for you both. So off you go.
Thanks, Stephen. So I don't have great news about the food system, which I do consider to be broken in many ways. But the one that I'd like to begin with is something that came out almost 5 years ago, which was the Global Nutrition Report of 2016, which declared that our diets have become the #1 risk factor for the global burden of disease, which means that the cost of diseases caused by what we eat is higher than that caused by other factors. And one of the examples it covers was, of course, the consequence of excessive carbohydrate, sugar consumption, leading to diabetes, and the fact that at that point, there were 4 times as many sufferers from diabetes, 420 million people, as against in 1980 of 108 million people. The costs of that, something like $850 billion. If we look at the system today and what it delivers, that's one way of looking at it. Out of our 7 billion odd population, we've got micronutrient deficiencies in about 2 billion people, out of which about 0.8 billion, that's 800 million, are starving, as in do not get enough food at night. Out of these 7 billion, also we've got 1.9 billion who are overweight, out of which 700 million are obese. So this is the impact of the food system. And other impacts which are disease-related are, as the use of livestock antibiotics, we get antibiotic resistance in people, leading implications. We have a lot of research coming up on the cancer links of herbicides. And when we look at pesticides, it's not just plastics, which are well known nowadays in the press as causes of endocrine disruption, which means problems with our human reproductive system. But if we look at what are the largest drivers of endocrine disruption, it's actually the chemicals that we use, pesticides especially, in food systems. So on top of that, of course, food systems account for it in terms of its entire value chain, starting with the forest that was cut to grow the soya that was produced to feed the cattle that would generate the meat that was transported and the cost of transportation. If you account for the full food system, it's not agriculture is 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the food system of humans is more like 44 to 56% of the total greenhouse gases. So half the greenhouse gas generation is because of what we eat. These are some of the issues with the food system and why I say the food systems are broken. And it's not just the things that I've mentioned, but also use of fresh water and the loss of that biodiversity, and something like 2/3 biodiversity loss is ascribed to commodities. We do have a problem that we need to solve, but unfortunately, the ways that we measure performance in food systems, and this is something the previous speaker has brought up as well, is completion. We are looking basically at per hectare productivity of staple crops. That will effectively reinforce business as usual. I keep saying that you cannot manage what you do not measure. And what we are not measuring are the huge externalities along food chains that have to be acknowledged, measured, valued, and managed. And for that, we need systems thinking. So we need to do all this work towards getting better metrics for food systems in the context of a theory of change. And Information alone, is my experience, often fails to motivate change. You can discover bad news, you can size the bad news, you can quantify it in economic terms, and people will still be nonplussed. To emphasize to specific interest groups as to what's wrong with the food system for them. And people and health is number one. But of course, we also have to work with policymakers, talking them through the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, and the fact that pretty much all the SDGs depend on how we handle the food systems. We've already had the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and financiers being involved. And I think from people and policymakers to businesses to point out to them that until the food system, they are running with businesses that are likely to be defunct, because change is coming, my friends. So as we see food systems getting re-evaluated differently, and a project that I worked on called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity branched off into food simply because food systems were the largest impact on biodiversity, and some of the biggest benefits of nature were on food systems and simply not being recognized. So whilst beginning with biodiversity and nature, we ended up being explorers of the externalities of food systems, not because of choice, but because of lack of choice, because this was where we had to go to get us that we needed. And when we did that, we found that indeed there were ways of measuring food systems comprehensively, looking at not just the sort of pure profit mechanics of yield per hectare, quantity per hectare, but looking at things holistically, creating a template for measuring systems, entire food systems, and then valuing them. Valuing the stocks, measuring the flows, valuing the outcomes, valuing the impacts. The impacts being changes in produced capital for farmers and producers, changes in natural capital that belongs to future generations, changes in human capital in terms of improved human health as against worsened human health, and changes in social capital in terms of improved institutions, stronger social networks, and so on. It is possible to do this. It has been done. There's already something like 6 or 7 studies using this sort of comprehensive and universal framework. And the good news is that it seems to reinforce common sense, not something that you see very often. Today, in addition to having, I believe, the right sort of consensus metrics for measuring food systems, we also have a few rather remarkable examples of success of not following the wrong kind of food system. Today's dependency on chemical-based agriculture, what I call chemical farming, pesticides and fertilizers, has been challenged quite comprehensively. There are many examples of natural farming and examples of what is known as regenerative farming, which are popping up in different parts of the world. One that I'd like to bring to your attention is one from my country in India. It's in a state called Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh is in the southeast of India. It has something like 60 million people, out of which 6 million are farmers. And out of those 6 million farmers, a movement began, which was driven by a retired civil servant of all people, asking his women's self-help groups that he had created if they would like to do farming differently, and explained how. And that led to a gradual increase in the use of natural farming techniques, recognizing fundamentally that agriculture is actually about biology, not chemistry. And if you can re-inject the soil biology that's been missing for years and decades in some cases, thanks to the application of pesticides, if you can leverage what you know about how soil responds and recognize that actually soil bacteria are the ones that convert the minerals that are in the soil and materials that are in the soil into food for the plants, osmose it into the food systems, into the plant's roots, and recognize that there are productivities available locally, you end up with the results that they have found. So, cut a long story short, we have a system which has generated higher productivity in all of the 8 strains of rice that they grow out there, in their main cash crop, that is groundnuts, peanuts, in fruit, in vegetables, even in maize. And higher, when I say higher, things like chili, for instance, is almost 80% higher productivity, and the various strains of rice are between 8 and 15 higher productivity in terms of produce per hectare. On top of that, they halve the amount of water used because of constant mulching techniques and so on, and the mulching and row cropping ideas that they use. And on top of that, they are capturing carbon. And most importantly, perhaps, they're not falling ill as a result of diseases, as a result of problems caused by the misuse or the excessive use of pesticides. So there are solutions, my friend, and the good news in that part of the world, not very far from where I am, but it's that we've already reached and crossed 700,000 farmers out of those 6 million farmers have transitioned across to some extent or the other to natural farming. And this group, which is now supported by the local government as well as by philanthropy, the Wipro Foundation, India's largest technology firm, the founder, Azim Premji, this group has a target for itself to cross 1 million following next year. So my advice is let's watch this space and see what we can do to help it to replicate and to scale. Thank you.
Great. Well, Pavan, it's terrific to have such a positive example at the end of your presentation, and that story about the sort of impact of regenerative techniques in that Indian state so close to you is fantastic. But I just want to be, I want to keep things as simple as possible. So Maximo, I'm going to go back to you in your presentation first. Am I right in thinking that what you are saying, if you apply these sort of true accounting principles to farm price mechanisms, you're basically saying that the foodstuffs produced the way they are currently produced in a country like the United States should be at least twice as expensive as they currently are if their true cost were represented at the supermarket cash till when consumers were buying their food. Prices would go up substantially, right?
Not necessarily. So the logic of the true cost accounting is to understand what is the value of the externalities that we are creating when we produce food. And there are 3 dimensions of those externalities. There is a dimension of the inputs used, and what are the externalities of those inputs. For example, when we don't value water properly, that goes into a crop and that is not priced in the market. Like in California, for example, the water is priced properly, so that value is incorporated. In Peru, the water is not priced properly, so that value is not incorporated into the product. The soil issues and so on. And then on the other hand, you have the externalities that production could create, which could be linked to greenhouse gas emissions, could be linked also to pollution because of excessive use of pesticides. And that also needs to be taken into account. And then you have the third dimension, which is basically effects over consumers, because, for example, they don't have access to healthy diets, and that will create non-communicable diseases, and there has to be value, which is affecting the health and the life of people. Now, this is for us to know what are those and what are the values of those, because it could be with proper policies and proper incentives behind, those could be minimized. Let me give you a very concrete example. When you have a system in which you pump water and you subsidize the energy to pump water, you will create a fiscal problem. That fiscal problem won't be reflected on the price. And at the same time, you will be depleting your water frame. And even it could be that your distributional effects are negative because the bigger pumps are with the richer farmers. Now, if the policies change and you don't have that subsidy, then we are starting to incorporate and you are trying to minimize those externalities. So not necessarily will imply higher prices. It could imply better information to make better policies and make better choices.
I mean, applying the sort of true value test and the true cost test, there are going to be winners and losers, right? In terms of the foodstuffs that we will eat in the future if we move more toward a true cost notion of our food system. Some foodstuffs, I'm thinking maybe of meats, will become way more expensive to take on board the true cost, and it will be things that you've alluded to, like the healthcare costs of people with illnesses associated with too much fat in their diets, for example. This could be one way of looking at it. So where do you two think the sort of winners and losers will be in terms of diet and what we eat? Give me a thought on that. You start, Pavan.
So we need to be, okay, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I'll just say a few examples, and I'm sure you'd like to go. But I think human health and our health would be the number one winner, Stephen. I think the ability to avoid pesticides and their impacts on human health, to avoid disruption, to avoid the antibiotic resistance, all of these will lead to better human health. So I think one key winner will be the citizen and her children with benefits.
But I always think about more of analyzing whether, globally, there's going to have to be a fundamental change of what we eat. I understand the point about pesticides and inputs and all of that.
Yes.
That's very important. But,
Yeah.
but do we also, as consumers around the world, need to recognize that it'll involve us changing our diets?
I think our diets are already beginning to change. People are more conscious of what they purchase and its origins, whether it is grown locally, whether it's grown without using chemicals, whether there's also an understanding of the need for balance in your diets and not to just see meat as the only solution. I mean, if you look at meat, the constant refrain we hear from meat lobbies is that, oh, it's necessary for protein. Well, fact of the matter is that meat today grows on 3/4 of the land that is used for agriculture. The total amount of land on earth that is used for agriculture is 40%. Out of that, 30% of the land on earth is basically dedicated to growing meat. And in addition, there's 3% growing feedstock for livestock. So you can say 1/3 of the land on earth is actually basically a glorified cattle ranch. And it's only generating 27% of the protein that human beings consume. So that pitch that it's all about meat and protein is wrong. It's just lies. So we're going to need to get used to that. And of course, the losers will be, in my opinion, basically two industries. One is agrochemicals and the other is meat. These are the only losers. Everything else, in my opinion, will be a winning sector.
Maximo, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I take it in a different way. Okay, if we look today, the consumption of meat in the world, there is regions of the world that are over-consuming meat, and there are regions of the world that are under-consuming meat, and that's the challenge. The incentives needs to be aligned for the over-consuming regions to reduce their consumption, and therefore to reduce the methane emissions as a result of that. And for the regions that they still need meat until they can find an alternative in terms of proteins, they need to consume more, and we cannot neglect that. Now, on the other hand, if we look at where the subsidies of the governments are going today, and that's part of the issue I was raising, most of the subsidies are not going towards a better access to healthy diets. 3 billion people today don't have access to healthy diets. But most of the subsidies are going to staple commodities, and staple commodities are also used for feedstock for meat. Okay, so we need to find a way to understand what that implies, what are the consequences of those policies, and how that is also affecting the health of people and the choices of people in terms of diets. And just repurposing those subsidies could create a big difference, especially in developed countries, which is where they are highest. And that could help to create that balance that we're looking for. So I think there are different dimensions around it. It's not just one little dimension. We need to understand the negative effects that some policies are creating because of some other reasons that they are put in place, but which are creating a problem to the health of the individuals.
Let me just ask you about...
But if may I reply to that to explain why I focus on the meat loss?
Yeah, quickly. I'll tell you what,
So
when you were talking at the beginning, we heard you really well because I think you had a microphone on as well as your laptop, and then you may have knocked the mic, and I'm finding it a little harder to hear you. I don't know.
Is this better now?
Oh, yeah, that's much better.
Okay, so no, why to Maximo? So yes, I agree with Maximo. There are many different dimensions to the whole food system. But the reason I picked the meat one, Maximo, is that if you look at externalities, something that you have done, let's go back to the study that was done way back in 2013 for the UNPRI and for the Tea for Business Coalition. It demonstrated that yes, the highest externality sector in terms of just dollars of externalities was coal-fired power in Eastern Asia, and the third highest was coal-fired power in North America. The second highest, if you recollect, was actually meat production in Latin America. So it's basically beef growing in Brazil, Argentina, etc. Now, the ratio of externalities to actual turnover was something like 18 times, and that was the single highest number that we had. That's the reason why I focus on meat, because of just the size of its externalities versus the value addition that it provides. In other words, the difference between the true cost and the actual market price.
Pavan,
of course, there are lots of other aspects which one can cover, but this is the most staringly obvious one.
We're sort of getting most of what you're saying, but for some reason there's a little bit of dropout on your line, and we're not getting it terribly clearly. I'm tempted to say, given the sign behind you and your consultancy's name, we're getting the gist of what you're saying, but we're not getting all of it.
I'll change technology in a moment.
Yeah. I want to put...
Can I say something to that?
No, no, you got to wait for me because I got to ask you a question. listen, you guys weren't here earlier, but we had a fantastic contribution from a farmer. And so often in these debates, the farmers themselves, we discuss them all the time, but they don't necessarily get their voice heard directly. But Zeno Piatti, who's a farmer in Austria, was saying, from his point of view as a farmer, there was sometimes a great deal of naivety about this debate because so much pressure is put on farmers to use the most sustainable methods, to focus on soil regeneration, biodiversity, all of the different things that we demand of their farmers, but the money isn't there for farmers to be able to do this and remain in business. It's very, very difficult for farmers, particularly small farmers whose margins are very thin. So I'm just thinking, what do you two think is the message for farmers? As you say, you want the true cost of food production to be reflected. Where do the farmers fit into this picture? And Maximo, this has got to go to you because Pavan's just disappeared. So,
no, I think that what the farmer mentioned is exactly correct. The point here is that we try to put policies without understanding even the cost benefit of those policies. And the information on the true cost of food should be essential to understand the cost benefit. Now, if the objective function is to produce more food to be able to feed people with healthy diets, then the incentives have to be realigned so that those small farmers can have access to those practices. But the last thing that we should do is to force a farmer to change the way they produce and to be non-cost effective when at the end the market won't recognize that. Let me give you a very simple example, okay? When we have production of maize, normally in countries with humidity, you will have aflatoxins, okay? Reducing aflatoxins imply changing practices of farmers and imply investment. Even the testing is expensive. Now, a farmer that takes this message, because we know that aflatoxins can create problems of cancer, liver cancer, and can also affect nutrition of kids, a farmer will do his investment. He will incorporate that externality and try to minimize it. Another farmer on the other side says, I don't care about it. Both goes to the market, and you arrive to the market, and the market doesn't recognize grain with aflatoxins or without aflatoxin. Okay, so the market is not recognizing that improvement in the commodity. So the poor farmer that did investment basically lost his money. So we cannot take only one part of the production cycle. We need to take also the other part of the production cycle, which is the market. And the market needs to recognize those attributes that we want to pay for. And if there is a failure on that, then the governments have to play a role.
exactly.
To cover that market failure.
So if the market isn't working, what is the role that government should play? Should it be putting swingeing taxes on, certain practices, massively hiking, I don't know, government duties on pesticides and nitrogen fertilizers and things that now are regarded as, damaging and that their costs are not being truly reflected in food pricing? Does the government need to intervene if the market isn't doing so?
Yeah, let me give you two clear examples. One, in the case of aflatoxins, clearly the government has to work on developing the standards in the market so that these attributes are being recognized when the grain is aflatoxin free. Okay? In the case that you have pesticides that are contaminated the environment, the government needs to incorporate those costs of what is the contamination of this public good, which is the water that we have to access, and then identify what measures they have to put in place to minimize that intensive use of pesticides. The same applies with fertilizers. Governments have to invest in data of soil maps so that farmers can use more efficiently fertilizers to minimize any potential issue of overuse of those. So again, there are clear public goods where governments can play a role and put the incentives and reduce this asymmetry of information to help proper decisions.
Yeah, Pavan, I don't know if you were able to hear just the last bit of the conversation. I'm just asking how important is government intervention to change the balance of incentives and costs?
I agree with Maximo. It is very significant. And the example that I quoted, in the Indian context, the actual subsidy on nitrogenous fertilizers, urea mainly, is something of the order of 66% of the market price, and that's basically paid across to the producers. Now, instead of that, if some of that fiscal cost could be used more intelligently to support small farmers and enable them to choose the inputs that they want. I believe that would make a huge difference. And these are some of the changes that are being considered as we speak by the government. So it is about changing subsidies, aligning them better to public goods and their provision, and aligning them to human health and its implications. So I think there's quite a lot to be done by governments when it comes to promoting the right forms of agriculture in the right context. Remember, out of the 525 odd million farms worldwide, 400 million are less than 2 hectares. That's basically small farms. So when we speak about farmers, my only experience is, to be honest, with small farmers. I met them many times, spoken with them in their languages, and what I'm hearing is a different story. I'm hearing a story of past dependency that has been created as a result of decades of misapplied policy and misconceived incentives, which may have benefited at some stage in the past, in the 60s and 70s, but honestly have lived their course and have created more environmental and now health damage than they have created private profits.
Right. The state you talked about, the amazing project, which is
Andhra Pradesh.
Andhra
Yes.
Pradesh.
Andhra
I'm just
Pradesh,
thinking
yes.
it's an awful long way
Yes.
from the European Union, but I wish you could bring some of the lessons you've learned from Andhra Pradesh and bring them here to Brussels, because it sounds fascinating. But anyway, let's leave that for another day. Let's just turn to some questions from our audience here in Brussels in the flesh and online. I'm going to go to one from online, which, Maximo, very briefly, if you would, because we'll try and get as many questions as we can. The question's from Wilfred Legg, and he says, if you're going to bang on about the real and true costs, then it has to be applied to all sectors, not just the agri-food system. In order to have correct, quote unquote, relative prices, then it's no good just taking the agri-sector on its own. It's got to apply to all sectors, surely. That's his point. If you're truly going to address the environmental, resource, and income distribution implications, it can't just be agriculture doing this on its own. It's got to be part of a much wider true cost approach.
I fully agree with that point. He's basically talking about a very important economic concept of relative prices. No? So relative prices are central to make policy decisions. Economists don't think on nominal, we think on relative real prices, and relative price is a way to put it in real terms. Now, why is this so important? Because agriculture has been the culprit of all these issues of emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. And it is true, there is significant methane emissions, especially coming from agriculture and from livestock. But there are other sectors that also have significant levels of emissions. There are other sectors that still are not properly measured that we need to take into account. So yes, if we're going to do the true cost accounting, it has to apply across the board. If not, we will be misleading the policy decisions between sectors, which is central.
I'm looking, Pavan, don't worry, because we're going to get more questions. I'm looking for hands up in here, and I'm also looking at the screen. I've got one on the screen which takes us back to tax and to meat, but it's a question better put than anything I've come up with. It's from Petra Reiter, and Petra says, what about the potential there is in changing the tax system? For example, taxing non-organic and non-sustainably produced meat consumption, and then use those tax revenues to finance a transition to more sustainable food systems. Does that make sense to you? Tax being a big part of this? Pavan?
Well, whether it's the removal of subsidies or the imposition of taxes, it's really what we're saying is reflecting reality. And I think there are political compulsions which may make it more difficult sometimes to raise a new tax as against reduce an existing subsidy which society accepts as being inappropriate and whose time has passed. So it's a question of making political choices as well with a similar fiscal impact.
May I add something quickly?
Yes.
Because normally we believe, for example, to reduce consumption of sugar, we have to tax more sugar. And that not necessarily will end with the output that we're looking for. Because the industry will immediately adjust and find mechanisms in which they will accelerate the consumption of sugar because of the taxes being imposed. So we need to be very careful, and we need to carefully assess the impacts of those policies. And it could be that we need to find an alternative mechanism which is better, like, for example, creating a significant behavioral change through the consumers. So providing positive incentives for consumers to change the behavior that will affect then the supply side, because the demand will be different and the supply will respond. Normally, we use a lot of our public resources for the supply side, and we forget about the demand side, which could drive in a more market-oriented way the supply side.
Right. Pause, gentlemen. I'm just looking to see if any hands are up in here, just to see if anybody's got a question for you. I've got one. We've got only a couple of minutes left. I've just got one. Throughout today, you won't be so aware, because I know you haven't been able to be with us all day, but we're very aware that this year's forum is taking place in the context of a horrible conflict, a war in Ukraine, caused, of course, by that Russian invasion of sovereign European territory. It's going to have huge knock-on effects on food prices, particularly of cereals, of course, because it's the breadbasket of so much of the world. And even before the Ukraine war, we were seeing a global spike in food prices. All of your focus on true cost accounting, on really reflecting the true costs of food production in the pricing of food, and trying to shift to much more sustainable methods of food production. It's not a great environment right now to be doing that, is it? Because it will, in some cases, mean rising food prices. And in a context where food prices are rising anyway, you've got a big problem, haven't you?
No, I disagree with you. True cost accounting doesn't mean that prices will go up. Now, true cost accounting is to understand what are the costs of those externalities and of those inputs that we are not valuing.
But in practical terms, it does mean some food prices will go up. Surely, you can't get around that.
It depends on how it evolves. Not necessarily, because it could be that we can reallocate existing resources in a proper way, and some foods, some commodities will lower their prices. Just shifting the subsidies from staples to high-value commodities will reduce the cost of healthy diets. So not necessarily to what you're saying. The important thing is to understand and know the magnitude of those.
Right. Okay, I get you.
I agree
I
with
get
Maximo.
you.
Yeah.
Go on, Pavan. Final thought from you.
Yeah, I agree with Maximo. It is not just one. I mean, remember, there are many wallets that we use to pay for food. You keep thinking of only your supermarket wallet with which you pay for what you buy from the shelves. What about the health wallet, which is accompanying that? What about the future generations wallet? What about the climate wallet and the damage that is caused by certain kinds of food, which is high on GHG and methane emissions? So I think we need to be a bit more comprehensive in the way we say more expensive. What does it mean expensive when all you're accounting for is one of the 4 wallets which you carry all the time?
Fair point. And that's on me for not seeing the bigger picture, but it's a good point, well made. We've reached the quarter to the hour point, which is the point where we have to say farewell to you two. So I've really enjoyed having you both on screen. Thank you for being patient with us here in Brussels. And ladies and gentlemen, please thank Maximo and Pavan very much for their contributions. Thank you, gentlemen.